I'm going to be talking about Ember.js. That's the official title. It's a framework for ambitious web applications. That's actually on the Ember site. It's also a pretty ambitious talk, being that Ember is really big and we only have 40 minutes. So I'll do my best. My name is Bruce Williams. That's where you can find me on Twitter. I live in Portland, Oregon, which is about 535 miles north of here. And I work for a tiny, tiny little company called Living Social, which only has 100 and something developers these days. So we're actually quickly growing and actually going to be looking at hiring a lot of developers in the Bay Area soon. So this is Portland, Oregon. I put this slide in here primarily to show those of you that live in the Bay that we actually do see sunshine. This is the one day a year that we get it, so we have a snapshot. It's a beautiful city. I have a reasonably sized office there. They were kind enough to give us an office. There used to be only 3 developers there in town, and I think we've about quadrupled that, and the office is growing. Love living there. Moved there about 2 years ago. That's enough about that. So this is fair warning. I write a whole lot of Ruby partially just so that you know I'm going to attempt not to swear during this presentation. It'll be difficult. I'm an author, for better or for worse. I've been doing Rails work since the beginning. I've been involved with Ruby since about 2001, so long before it became useful. And this talk is really just going to be kind of a taste of various pieces of Ember, because we just simply don't have enough time to get through it all or to delve really, really deeply. Who here, by the way, uses Ember? Who has it in production? Cool. Who's tried it? Played with it? Okay. So Living Social, or my team at Living Social, we're taking a look at various options that we had in the JavaScript space. We were working on a mobile application that we wanted to keep in WebKit, primarily for portability reasons. And I had hacked something horrible together, really mind-numbingly horrible. I did it with my boss, and I'd love to blame him, but a lot of it was me. And but it had some nice features that I liked, which is the way that you get addicted to things and you keep them around forever. And I think eventually I ran into the horrible case where someone else had to use my code. And I was thrust against the decision to toss it and use something better, which I thankfully did. And we took a look at a lot of things out there. I've done a lot of backbone work, or at least a fair amount of backbone work in the past, which I really enjoyed. But there were some things relating to state machines and an ORM that we really wanted to have because we were going to go into a much more ambitious space. So I happen to know Yehuda Katz from the Ruby space, and we knew that he was working on something, so we started to talk to him. So Ember is an MVC client-side framework. MVC is such a flexible set of letters, especially in JavaScript, it seems like. Everybody seems very confused about, between one framework to the next, what those letters might mean, especially in the case of V. But this is the way it worked for Ember. Ember used to be Sprout Core originally, or inspired by Sprout Core. Yehuda was involved with the original Sprout Core project, which built things like iCloud. Tom Dale, who's part of Tilde as well, was involved with iCloud. I used Sprout Core a few years ago, and I hated it. Like, really passionately hated it. And I hated it not because it wasn't a neat piece of technology, because undeniably it was a neat piece of technology. But it was a really big piece of technology that was really hard for me to jump in. So what Sprout Core 2.0 as an idea came to be was kind of paring down Sprout Core to its essentials, at least trying to get rid of some of the widgets and the dojo-ness of the product. So it diverged significantly enough away from Sprout Core that they decided to rename it. And after some hiccups, they landed on Ember as the name. This is my rough sketch about how Ember works. We have actually two libraries, Ember and Ember Data. I'm going to briefly cover Ember Data as well. But basically, we have the MVC part of this crosses that line between Ember Data and Ember. Controllers and views, and there's a state manager that handles switching sections of the page. And there's also now a routing layer, which is actually the thing that I really missed from Backbone. And the model portion is all up in Ember Data, and you can decide never to use that if you don't want to use that. And that's a useful way of getting things to persist to your server. This is how I kind of think of it as well. That last one was a modified, expanded version of the actual chart that's on the Ember documentation. This is kind of how it feels to me on a day-to-day basis. You've got your UI bits, which are your views and your templates. The controllers, which controllers are basically nothing in Ember, really. And then you have your volatile data, which is your client-side ORM stuff, talking back to your server. So some really brief comparisons. Already talked about Sprout Core. Don't need to go into that again. Backbone. So I love Backbone. However, if there's anything that I know about Backbone, it's that Backbone is almost always a very tiny piece of whatever you end up building. Between multiple companies, what people generally tend to do are to build much larger company-focused frameworks on top of Backbone. That's actually a really good thing, I think, in a lot of cases. But in our case, we needed something where some of these decisions were made for us. Knockout, just as an example, is something that's more template-focused, dealing with DOM bindings. I think that the major difference between Knockout and Ember is just the fact that there's not a conflation between views and templates, and it is certainly more structural than Knockout is. So some useful things for you to do if you're looking for more information on Ember, in case anybody wants to browse now. So some notes on stability as well. So I feel pretty confident using Ember in production. I know there's at least a couple people here that use it in production. That feels okay to me. Ember Data is a lot fuzzier. So you have to be willing to put some time in on Ember Data right now if you want to get it out there. And I talked to Yehuda yesterday, and he said that both of these are looking at a 1.0 release sometime within the next few months. So, and I'll talk on where the shortcomings are in Ember Data in a minute. Size, it's somewhat large. However, it does have all the dependencies in it besides jQuery. And this is everything. This is the DOM bindings, the computed properties, and the rest that we'll get into. And you can, of course, he's actually broken it out into much smaller pieces that you can kind of cobble together how you like. So an Ember application starts with creating an instance of Ember application. So Ember has something called Ember Object, which gives you class inheritance. And the way that you create an instance of a class is by calling create. This is, I mean, you can see this all over JavaScript, so comforting to a Rubyist like myself. So that gives you class inheritance. This is probably the most important thing in Ember is Ember Object. Everything sits on top of Ember Object. It's the abstract superclass of everything within the system. So it has all of the cool bits that everything else uses to compose the amazing behavior that you get out of it. So class inheritance, to include things like mix-ins, Ruby-style mix-ins, where you can basically separate out concerns and pull them into pieces into individual components that have kind of common behavior. It has computed properties with dependencies, which we'll talk about here in a second, and property bindings as well, which keep properties on these Ember objects up to date across the application. And also has observers, which allows you to execute some piece of code anytime something changes. And that's built into the most core object. So as you can imagine, this allows you to kind of, first of all, I mean, in a bad way, I guess you could say, it takes you off the ivory tower of MVC anytime you want to get off of it. You can connect things really tightly and couple them. Or you can be strict and, segment your concerns more carefully. This is essentially how you define a new class. You notice 2 slides back, I created window.app here. So I'm using that as the common root namespace for everything else. So what an application gets you is it gets you things like event handling. In addition to a namespace, and an Ember namespace gives you much better error reporting when it's logging out to the console. And actually, Ember has gotten a hell of a lot better with getting that out there lately. So in this case, what we're doing is creating a new class, and we're assigning it to order. Simple. It has one property, which is state, which is just a string. So you can see in here, I'm actually creating an order. This is an actual instance of the order. And in the second one, I'm overriding what the state is. So you can think of these properties here as the defaults for any instances that are created. This is what an Ember object looks like. So it's got a lot of stuff going on. This is how you track getting properties, setting up any connections between various parts of the object to other objects in the system. It can be, I'll tell you, I mean, we were involved with Ember really early on, and this was painful at first to understand. There's a lot of things going on there, and it takes time. But there's some really cool things you can do with it. So this is something to watch out for. There's a number of blog posts that mention this kind of problem with it, which is that when you create a property, when you're actually defining your class as kind of a default for those instances, you can get in the case where if I'm pushing additional items, this specifically is issues with arrays and objects, not things like strings, null, true, false, whatever, mutable objects. If I push onto it, it's going to affect that particular property among all instances of that class. The way to get around this is in your class, you can actually override a function called init and then super inside of it. And inside of init, you can do all your defaulting to make sure that you have a separate array for each instance. This is just a quick example of what a mixin is. A mixin looks a lot like, actually, it looks a lot like when you're creating a class, except you use create because it's an instance of Ember mixin. You put your properties in there, you can include functions, and then you can just mix that into either classes or instances of classes at any time. Ember uses this a lot. For instance, ember.enumerable is a mixin that it uses on like array controller and various other places. So properties. Computer properties are probably the coolest thing in Ember. It's the core of basically any behavior that you create. The way that you handle it, if you can notice, I've got the state new at the top there. And basically, I wanted a property that I could ask the object whether or not. Let's pretend what we're talking about here is an order that can be packed to be sent. This is kind of, think of this as order fulfillment. Okay? And we have a property called state. So isPacked is a computed property that depends on the state property, which you can see there because I'm calling property on the function, and passing any dependencies, and there can be multiple. So this will, first of all, get calculated the first time that I call get is packed on this instance. And it will be recalculated the next time I call it if that state property has changed. I'll talk about cacheable here in a second. And there's some changes involved with cacheable. It's very important that you always use get and set to access properties. This is the most painful thing to me on a daily basis when I was using Ember, was I would just directly assign things, and then things would not fire. I wouldn't know why I wasn't seeing what I should be seeing. And it was because I was being stupid. And at the end of the day, you have to make sure that you're using set and you're using get when you're accessing properties and changing them. So one of the major changes that's coming around the bend right now, and you'll see a big ugly deprecation notice when you use Ember, is currently properties are volatile. And what that means is every time I get a property, it will reevaluate that block regardless. It'll just reevaluate it. So you end up tossing cacheable on there, which basically says do not reevaluate it unless I am depending on unless this property changes. There's some interesting semantics around volatile and cacheable. However, what's going on right now is we're actually switching over so that cacheable is the default. So you can leave cacheable off, and you can call things cacheable or volatile as you like. But if you want it cacheable, you can just leave it off, which is, I think, the most normal activity. So I use CoffeeScript all the time. I don't know how any of you feel about that. Maybe it's because I'm a Rubyist and I like iterations to be nice and simple. And I'm a baby about syntax. But I think the main thing here is one of the things that have always annoyed me about JavaScript, which I say in front of a room full of JavaScript developers, is function as a word. I've done a lot of functional languages as well, Haskell and other languages like that. It's always annoyed me that the language that's so full of function feels the need to declare function all over the place. It should be something that's a little bit simpler. That's one of the main reasons why I like CoffeeScript. It's a literal because it's all over the place. It's literally all over the place, so I just make it a literal. So anyways, it tends to clean up your Ember code quite a bit because you are going to wrap functions in parens and call property on them all over the place, regardless of whether or not you set this up in Vim or TextMate or whatever else you want so that you can autocomplete property. This just makes things a lot cleaner. But for the sake of this talk, I'm not going to be using CoffeeScript. Some more lower level tools here. This is just basically how you can get and set things. And you can get and set things using full paths as well, and it will walk down the chain and try to find the right property for you. The top are kind of the low level things. The bottom here are the things you use on a regular basis. In addition to, when you saw the property state, that was an example of this first case here. That if it starts with a lowercase letter, it's going to look up at the current scope. So it says, it's this object, what's this property named foo or state. If it starts with a capital letter, which is why you have to, when you create classes in Ember, start things with a capital letter, it will look at it from the root. Okay, so a simple example of binding something to the DOM. And we're going to do it willy-nilly and just bind an object directly in a template. So here we have our application that we created. We have our order that we've already created. We're actually going to set current order on an application. This is just so that we can hold on to this instance. Now, Ember uses handlebars. Anybody here not familiar with handlebars at all? Oh, good. Okay, so only a few people. It's pretty easy. It uses handlebars, but you can use whatever you'd like. There's ways of plugging in other templating languages as well. So in this case, what we're doing is we're just checking. Oops. There's a mistake here. This should say, instead of app.example_order, it should say current order. So if app.current order is packed, then say good job. Otherwise, we create a link and we bind the action to pack on that link. And I'll show you what that does here in a second as well. Okay. So when I display this for the first time, and you'll notice too, as well here that I have a script tag, which is type of text x handlebars, that's immediately going to get evaluated and inserted into the page. So you can just drop these into your HTML. There's other ways to do it as well, which I'll talk about. So we'll talk about action and how action works here. But what's interesting about this is that when I click that action and the isPacked property automatically changes, this view will automatically re-render because it's actually binding that isPacked property. That if is not just a plain if. It's not a one-time if. It's actually binding that property by looking it up to that piece. And it uses something called metamorph, which is a little library that basically lets you drop a script tag here, drop a script tag here, and use DOM ranges to replace parts of the DOM, which is built into Ember. So I'll talk about action here in a second as well. We're going to add a view on top of this. And the reason why we're going to add a view is because there's a lot of times where you want to munge some data, you want to display something in a certain way, but it doesn't make sense for you to go ahead and add that onto your data model. It just gets messy. You end up with a lot of things doing date formatting or whatever. So it sits between your data model and the thing that you actually want to show. It also handles looking up templates or dynamically generating a template on the fly if it needs to change out templates based on the type of object you're trying to display, that type of thing. So you can think of views are frequently in Ember used like a presenter. And it actually handles events too. So this should be familiar to those of you who've used Backbone. So we're just going to add a view here called order status. And order status has a template name of order status, and it's going to have a function called pack on it. You'll notice that pack is getting order, and there's no order set here. You don't see an order property on the order status. We're actually going to set that inside of our template, just as an example. Okay. So there's actually two templates here that you would drop into your HTML. The first one, you'll notice, this is the same one as before, essentially, except I'm just using order instead of app.currentOrder. But it actually has a data template name as well, which registers this with Ember as a template called order status. And the bottom one, this is the one that's going to automatically get inserted into the DOM because it doesn't have a template name. And here I'm using a helper called view. And what this does is it's going to take the name of the view that you pass it next, which is our order status class, and it's going to instantiate one of these. And then it's going to take any of the additional options on that line and pass that as it's instantiating that object. So in this case, I'm passing this thing called order binding. So this isn't order, but it's order binding. And this is another interesting bit about Ember is there's these things called binding properties, at least that's what I call them. Unfortunately, binding is a completely overused word. But what this means, any time that on an object you say foo binding with a capital B, it's going to take the value of that property as a string, like app.currentOrder here. And it's going to say, okay, where is this app.currentOrder? It uses ember.get to look it up, to walk the path, to find it. And then what it does is it sets a property with the name order on that object to the current value, and it binds it in such a way that if app.currentOrder ever changes, so let's say I go into a console, I'll say app.currentOrder is set that to a new order object, this will change the actual order that's referenced, which will involve a re-render as well. So order binding is just a nice way of saying this property right here is really a property somewhere else, and just keep it up to date all the time. So what happens here when we do this is it's going to create that instance of the view, and then it's going to insert it at that point. And the view is going to look up the template, which is the order status up above, and it's going to take that template, and the context of that template is going to be that view. So our order is going to be is app.currentOrder in the context of that template. So it's going to work the same way that it did before. We just have this view object in between. You'll notice this action pack. What that does is that when someone clicks onto that link, it will call the pack function on whatever context it is, which is the view. So if we look back here, you'll notice in the highlighted portion, that pack function will get called, which will just call pack on the order, which above just sets the state to packed, which in that first template will cause the if condition to change. That bound property will change because is packed will change. So what you do with Ember generally is you set up these templates, you set up these bindings of properties, and then you affect some property change that kind of sprinkles through, that propagates through the system and causes re-renders to occur as necessary. So it's a very declarative approach. Very, very infrequently do you say, you re-render. I'm going to re-render that view. You don't do that. You just change a property, and then that happens as a side effect. So another way to register templates, if you don't want to drop stuff willy-nilly into your DOM, is there's a constant templates, which is an object, and it's just key value pairs of the name of the template to a compiled handlebars template. And you would pretty much never do this yourself. You would use a build tool. I use something called Rake Pipeline, but you would use whatever you'd like to use. Some build tool to go ahead and generate those files off of some set of files. So, handlebar helpers. We already saw if. This is basic handlebars, except keep in mind that these are actually binding these properties so that it'll cause re-renders. So if property, else, self-explanatory. Unless works the same way. I think you can actually do unless else, which is horrible, and you should never ever do. Action, we already saw action as a way of binding events. So in this case, we're just going to call the function pack. And the next one we're going to call the function foo, and it's going to be on a different object entirely. So it won't be the enclosing scope, the context, the view. It'll be some other object. So this is a way to cause something in the template to call a function on some random object somewhere else, wherever you'd like. This is your opportunity to completely screw MVC if you'd like to do that. So next, you can also say what event it is. Double-click. There's a whole list of events, of course. You know them well. And you can cause those to happen. It's also worth noting, by the way, you can just make a function on your view called click. If you want the whole thing clickable, just make a function called click, and you're done. Someone clicks, that function gets called. You never even actually have to put anything inside your template. But because I want to call something pack, and because I only want part of it clickable, I'm actually using this action helper to insert that behavior into a specific tag in a template. A note on controllers. So controllers, if you actually, generally speaking, a controller in Ember is just like a ember.object.create. It's just some object that's assigned somewhere that you hang functions on. There's a few that have some special behavior. For instance, array controller you see here. If you give it a content property, which has a trailing comma there, if you give it a content property, it will act as an enumerable. So you can use, for instance, in this next example down below, I can say each app.orders controller there. And it will know what to do with that. Oh, OK, we're going to do each right now. I'm enumerable, so I'm going to iterate over the content. And this, in the context of that each, is that particular object, that particular order. With, up above, allows you to temporarily change the context of whatever enclosed content you have. So if you want to say, you know what, I'm going to do a bunch of stuff on an order right now, and I don't want to have to do order dot all over the place. You just wrap it in a with order, and then within that scope, you can just refer to the properties by their plain names. Collection, this is actually just a way of doing a quick list. View, we already talked about view, just a way of instantiating a view object. You can pass additional options to it. Worth noting that right now, when you can also do kind of ad hoc templates. You can say, I'm going to do a view. This is the view thing. This is the actual view class, but this is the template I want you to use. What's changing right now is that the context is not going to change within that scope. So that way, if you want to refer to things outside, up above the view helper line, you can without having to worry about it. So we're going to be changing that to be completely contextless, so it'll inherit its parent scope, and you will have to refer to any property you want to talk about with that specific view as view.prop. There's some nice debugging helpers as well. You can log something to console from handlebars. You can insert a debugger entry point, which is very handy. You can also register your own helpers. And one thing to keep in mind is the double curly's version of handlebars escapes HTML. So if you want to avoid that problem, you can use handlebars.safestring. Or you, of course, can use the triple curly's. But that's an API concern. Observers, we talked about properties earlier. Properties only execute when you actually get to that property. Observers fire immediately when a change happens. So in that first case, anytime the state property changes, that will fire all the time. In the second example here, where I'm actually making an observer, this is kind of more metal, lower level. The only thing that you have to keep in mind here is you have to remove that observer yourself. There's a remove observer function to call. If you don't do that, there's a chance of a memory leak there. So, state manager. So just a real quick. By the way, I don't know if you've noticed. In the bottom right-hand corner of some of these examples, I've got JS fiddles. I've got several of them that have this code live so that you can play with them. But, I've got a list of them at the end. So one cool thing about Ember is you can say, here is, I want this whole portion, I want this whole section of the page to change. I want the whole page to change. This is actually what my original system did that I thought was awesome, which actually is not that awesome, but it was called sheets. And you could say, this is where your initial sheet is, then I changed to this sheet. It was just a finite state machine. It was stupid simple. It was horrible because I had the transitions all listed. There's actually a really nice finite state machine inside of Ember where you can define how you want things to flow. So for instance, let's say there's two people in this order fulfillment system where there's one guy that goes and picks up all the items for the order out of the warehouse, and there's another guy that packs it. So in this case, I wanted you to be able to go to the application and see the picker dashboard and be able to switch over to the packer dashboard and switch back and forth at any point. And these are just view states, so you can create states that have nothing to do with views that you just want to model the behavior of your application using a finite state machine, which is a good idea with a GUI. So in this case, I am saying that the picker dash is the initial state, which you see at the bottom there. It's a view state, which just means that it's going to manage a view. It's going to switch parts of the page out. And It has, you can see the view defined in each of these, where I just say I'm actually creating a cheap one-off view instance for each of these. It just wraps the template, picker dash and packer dash. And then in each of these cases, I'm also adding an action, which is and I could have done this, by the way, inside the view as well. I actually made an action inside the view, but there's an action inside of the state, which says, if I switch persona and I'm in this state, then I want you to tell the state manager, the object we're in, to go to state packer dash. And in the example, by the way, I think that I have here, I also have entry transit. Around those transitions, you can have entry and exit callbacks that can occur, that can set various properties for you. The state machine is a complex topic, but it's definitely worth delving in for larger and more complex applications. The new routing layer that we have is all about mapping URLs to that state machine, to individual states. And there's various ways that it will determine which particular route you want to use, whether it's path or it's a hash. And then it just initializes those states. It's really new. It's really raw. I haven't used it at all, quite frankly. But it is a cool idea. So quick primer on Ember data. Just a quick tour. So the major feature of Ember data is that it's got a store. It's an identity map. So when you go get objects from the server, you have a client ID. You go get more objects from the server, you're going to get the same client ID. It's that caching layer that you really need. You can create ephemeral stores too, as you like, if you want multiple sets, but generally speaking, you have one store per app. You have transaction support, so if something goes wrong when you are posting to your API, it will deal with rolling things back. It handles different types of attributes, so strings, numbers, dates. It is asynchronous, which is a benefit and a curse, as you all know. But it's generally a benefit as long as you deal with the callbacks correctly. But it can be complex. Asynchronous ORMs, there's a reason why there's not a whole lot of them out there. It's a hard problem. And the cool thing about it is you'll notice here there's an adapter that sits between the server and the store and the model so that you can define custom ways of talking to your API. A model looks like this. So you can just set this DS model extend. You can set attributes. It works. This looks very similar to what we had before. Different types here. You also have associations. It knows how to map product underscore ID to product ID. You can create records. This doesn't actually hit the server until you save. Delete records. This is all within the scope of that store. It's deleting it from the store. You can update a record, change properties, and then save, and that will actually handle serialization and contacting the server through the adapter. You can find records. It's the way to find all records. You can find a record by ID. The first time you do it, it'll hit the server. Any subsequent times, unless you've decided that you want to go refetch it, it's going to fetch it from the store. You can find by query. There's a couple different ways of doing that. This is one of them. This is how you set up, once you have Ember data in your app, which is how you actually set up a store. In this case, I'm using a DS Rust adapter. This revision is just a way for them to track exactly what version you're using, because it's a pretty unstable API. Fixture adapter. This is what I use a lot in development, just to kind of get things working. There is a delay in the queries so that it pretends to be asynchronous. And you can basically just assign fixtures as a constant and load it up with as much data as you want. And then just refresh, and then you've got a whole brand new starting point. Some tips, and we're running out of time, but I'm going to continue. JS hint. There's a great talk by Tom Dale on debugging Ember, and this is largely taken from that. Developer tools, of course. Know your breakpoints. You are going to need them with Ember. Use Ember namespaces because it gives you better error messages. And generally speaking, minify your own libraries. Minify all the libraries with your own build tools. Get better error messages there usually as well. So I use Rake Pipeline and Minispade for dependency loading, but feel free to use Require.js. There's a lot of approaches there. AMD, if that's what you like, use it. I'm using it on a project now, and I like it. Testing. Ember uses QUnit, but you can use Jasmine. Use whatever you'd like. Just use something. And I use Phantom.js so that I can run it directly from the terminal. So we're over time, but I'm not going anywhere. So if anybody has any questions. Yes?
Does Ember take care of disclosing views, unused views, like garbage collector?
Yes. It's a complex question, really. But yes, it does. I guess the jury's out on whether or not it does it very well, but because it's still pretty young. But it does do it. Yes?
Can you elaborate at all as to why Ember over Knockout, especially in regard to the fact that Ember relies on like a third-party,
The binding bit?
Yeah, thank you.
So Metamorph is written by Tom Dale, which is part of the core team. So I don't know if you can really call it third party. It's also this big. But I like Knockout a lot. But I think Knockout falls down a little bit on large projects. And we're talking, my project is many tens of thousands of lines of code. Many, many, many. So, yes? OK. Yeah, let's talk after. I've got to go off mic, but I'm happy to answer the questions for you.